You will pave that disgusting dirt track, or this board will pave it for you and bill you for every last cent. Is that clear? That was the line. That was the moment the quiet, grieving man who just wanted to be left alone died, and the structural engineer who spent 30 years solving impossible problems with logic and leverage took his place. It was the moment Carol, in her infinite, pantsuit arrogance, handed me the shovel to dig her own grave. She just didn't know it yet. Let me back up. My name is Mark, and for the better part of a year, I'd been living in a gray fog. My wife, Eleanor, had passed away after a long fight with an illness that had stolen her from me piece by piece. The house, our house, was the only thing that still felt like her. We'd bought it 5 years prior, a slightly older, slightly more rustic property on the very edge of the otherwise pristine Oak Haven estates. Our lot was bigger than most, buffered by a thick stand of pine trees that gave us a wonderful sense of seclusion. The real selling point for Eleanor, an artist who craved nature, was the gravel path. It wasn't a driveway in the traditional sense. It was a long, winding track of crushed stone and earth that snaked from the side of our house back to a small, converted barn she'd used as her studio. It was where she'd walk every morning, coffee in hand, to watch the birds and find her inspiration. After she was gone, I walked it for her. Every morning, I'd trace her steps, the crunch of the gravel under my boots a familiar, comforting sound. It was my connection to her, a dusty, half-mile thread holding me to the best parts of my life. Oak Haven Estates, on the other hand, was the antithesis of that path. It was a world of rigid right angles, chemically green lawns, and a homeowners association that governed with the iron-fisted precision of a military state. The bylaws were thicker than a phone book, dictating everything from the acceptable shade of beige for your trim to the maximum allowable height of a garden gnome. I'd mostly managed to stay off their radar. My property was on the fringe, and I kept to myself. I paid my dues on time, mowed the part of my lawn visible from the street, and generally tried to be invisible. In my grief, confrontation was the last thing on my mind. I just wanted peace. But peace is a foreign concept to people like Carol. Carol was the HOA president, a title she wore like a crown. She was a woman in her late 50s who seemed permanently clenched, as if bracing for a high G-turn. Her hair was a helmet of blonde spray, her eyes were small, suspicious beads, and she always carried a clipboard, which she wielded less as a tool and more as a scepter of judgment. My first real interaction with her had been about my mailbox. It was, according to a crisply printed notice left on my door, RAL 1001 beige, whereas the bylaws explicitly mandated RAL 1015 light ivory. The difference was imperceptible to the human eye, but to Carol, it was a glaring act of rebellion. I repainted it without a fight. It wasn't a hill worth dying on. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. It was just the appetizer. The official letter arrived a month later. It was thick, creamy paper, embossed with the Oak Haven Estates logo, an oak tree being strangled by a perfect circle. The subject line read, "Violation Notice, Unapproved Road Surface, Lot 42." I read it, my brow furrowed in confusion. It claimed my unpaved access path was in direct violation of Bylaw 7, Section 4C, which stated all driveways and primary vehicle paths must be constructed of approved materials, namely asphalt or concrete pavers. It gave me 30 days to submit a paving plan for the board's approval and 60 days to complete the work. Failure to comply would result in daily fines of $100. I laughed. It had to be a mistake. The path was entirely on my property. It wasn't a driveway, my actual driveway was paved perfectly. This path led to a studio, not the street. It was functionally a part of my backyard. They had no jurisdiction. I decided to handle it calmly, logically. I brought a copy of my property survey to the next HOA meeting, held in the community center's sterile, fluorescent-lit conference room. Carol sat at the head of the table, flanked by her two board cronies, a nervous-looking man named Arthur who was the treasurer, and a stern woman who just nodded at everything Carol said. When the floor opened for resident concerns, I stood up. "Hi, Mark from Lot 42. I believe there's been a misunderstanding regarding a violation notice I received." Carol fixed me with a look that could curdle milk. "There is no misunderstanding, Mr. Mark. Your dirt track is an eyesore and a clear violation." "Actually," I said, laying the survey on the table and pointing. The path in question is located here, entirely within my property lines and well away from any shared land or public access. The bylaws you cited refer to driveways connecting to community roads. This path connects my house to my studio. It's essentially a garden path. I expected a moment of realization, maybe a grudging apology. What I got was a masterclass in condescension. "We are not debating semantics," she sniffed, not even glancing at the survey. "The path is visible from the walking trail behind your property. It lowers the aesthetic standard of the entire community. It creates dust. It's a haven for weeds. It will be paved." The room was silent. A few of my neighbors shifted uncomfortably. They knew she was overreaching, but no one wanted to be her next target. Fear was the currency of Carol's kingdom. "With all due respect, Carol," I said, keeping my voice even, "the HOA's authority ends at my property line. You can't compel me to make a 5-figure modification to my private land that isn't covered by the bylaws." She smiled, a thin, predatory slash. "The bylaws also grant the Architectural Review Committee, which I chair, broad authority to maintain the harmonious residential character of Oak Haven. Your mud pit is not harmonious. The notice stands." Next agenda item. I stood there for a moment, the survey feeling flimsy and useless in my hand. I had used logic. I had presented evidence. It hadn't mattered. This wasn't about rules, it was about power. And I had challenged hers. The fines started appearing in my mailbox, each one a little paper insult. Then came the escalation. One afternoon, I came home to find 2 men from a local paving company on the gravel path with a measuring wheel. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice tight. "Yeah, HOA president sent us over to get an estimate on paving this," the foreman said, chewing on a toothpick. "You're trespassing," I said flatly. "Get off my property." He shrugged and they left, but the message was clear. Carol was moving forward, with or without my consent. A few days later, a post appeared on the community Facebook page. It didn't name me, but it was obvious. A reminder to all residents that maintaining community standards is a shared responsibility. Neglected properties and unapproved surfaces can negatively impact everyone's property values and reflect poorly on our wonderful neighborhood. The post was followed by a string of comments from Carol's sycophants, all agreeing about the importance of keeping up appearances. I was being publicly shamed, painted as the neighborhood slob. The frustration was a hot coil in my gut. I'd lost my wife, I was trying to hold my life together, and now I was being harassed over a path of rocks and dirt that held some of my most precious memories. Still, I tried reason one last time. I sent a certified letter to the board with a copy of my survey, my deed, and a legal opinion from a real estate lawyer friend confirming the HOA had no standing. I outlined the facts clearly and calmly, requesting they rescind the violation and cease all harassment. The response was a notice taped to my door. It was a formal threat to place a lien on my property for the unpaid fines and the estimated cost of the paving. That was it. That was the turning point. A lien. A legal claim against the home Eleanor and I had chosen together. The last sanctuary of her memory. It was no longer a petty squabble. It was a declaration of war. That night, I didn't walk the path. I sat in my office, the threatening letter on the desk in front of me. The grief and exhaustion that had clouded my mind for a year began to recede, replaced by something cold and sharp. I was a structural engineer. My entire career was built on understanding systems, finding stress points, and applying pressure until a problem resolved. Carol and her little HOA kingdom were just another system. A poorly designed one, full of vulnerabilities. And I was going to find them. I took out a fresh legal pad. At the top, I wrote a project title, The Carol Problem. My first step was to treat this like any engineering project, information gathering. I needed blueprints. I went to the county records office, a place that smelled of old paper and dust. I spent a full day pulling every document related to Oak Haven Estates, the original development plans, the articles of incorporation for the HOA, every revision of the bylaws, every plat map. I scanned them all and took them home. For the next week, I lived in those documents. I cross-referenced everything, building a complete picture of the development's history and the legal framework Carol was operating within. I also started a new habit. I bought a small, high-quality digital voice recorder. Every time I left the house, it was on. I also bought several discreet outdoor security cameras and placed them overlooking my property, especially the gravel path. If Carol or her minions set foot on my land again, I'd have it in high definition. Documentation was everything. My investigation into the HOA's history yielded a few minor inconsistencies, some procedural sloppiness, but no silver bullet. Carol ran a tight ship, at least on paper. But my research into my own property was a different story. Lot 42, my lot, was different. It had been part of the original farmland that the developer bought, but it was sold as a separate parcel before the main development began. My deed was older. The covenants attached to it were slightly different. This was interesting, but still not enough. I needed more. I needed to go deeper. I started looking at the history of the land itself, before it was a farm, before the town was even founded. I was looking for anything that might set my property apart. I found an old county survey map from the 1920s, a beautiful, hand-drawn document. And that's when I saw it. A thin, dotted line crossing through the area that would one day become my property. It was labeled, O.T. Path. I had no idea what O.T. meant. Old Trail. Ox Trail. It was a curiosity, a breadcrumb. I cross-referenced it with other historical maps. The line was consistent. It was a known feature of the landscape long before Oak Haven was a glimmer in a developer's eye. My gravel path followed the dotted line almost exactly. This was the moment the engineer in me got excited. I had found a structural anomaly, a detail that didn't fit the blueprint. Now I had to understand what it meant. I took a shot in the dark and called the anthropology department at the local state university. I got a friendly, slightly bored-sounding grad student on the phone. I described the map, the O.T. Path designation, and its location. "Hold on," he said, a new interest in his voice. "Can you send me a scan of that map and your current parcel location?" I did. An hour later, my phone rang. It was a professor, Dr. Eris Thorne. His voice was deep and serious. "Mr. Mark," he began, "what you have there is quite significant. OT doesn't stand for Old Trail. It stands for Osage Trace. You are living on a section of a major historical migratory and trade route used by the Osage Nation and other tribes for centuries." I felt a jolt, a sudden flash of insight. The air in my office suddenly felt thick with history. "The path on your property," he continued, "the one you said is still unpaved, it's very likely the last preserved remnant of that trace in this entire county. Most of it was destroyed by farming and development. If its physical integrity has been maintained, well, that is a discovery of some importance. A discovery of some importance." The words echoed in my mind. Eleanor had always said the path felt special, ancient. She'd said she felt a sense of peace there she couldn't explain. She was right. This was it. This was the leverage. This was the fulcrum on which I would move the world. Carol didn't just want me to pave a path. She wanted me to pour asphalt over a piece of history. She was threatening to bulldoze a registered, albeit forgotten, Indigenous heritage trail. My project plan, the Carol problem, suddenly got a lot more ambitious. This wasn't just about defending my property anymore. It was about poetic justice. I wasn't just going to stop her. I was going to use her own obsession with rules, her own arrogance, to let her destroy herself. The first phase of my new plan was validation. I needed official recognition. I coordinated with Dr. Thorne, who was genuinely excited by the find. He connected me with the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, the THPO, for the Osage Nation, a man named William Blackwood. Mr. Blackwood was a quiet, dignified man with eyes that seemed to hold a deep well of history. He came to my property a week later. I walked him down the path, the same path I walked every morning thinking of Eleanor. Now, I saw it through new eyes. I saw the ancient trees that bordered it, trees that would have been saplings when his ancestors walked this same ground. He spent hours there, walking, observing, taking soil samples. He barely spoke. Finally, as the sun began to set, he stood at the end of the path by the studio and looked back toward the house. "Your wife had good taste in studios," he said, his first personal comment all day. This path, it has the spirit of the people in it. It is what we thought was lost. He confirmed it. It was an authentic, undisturbed section of the Osage Trace. He told me he would begin the process of having it officially designated and protected under the National Historic Preservation Act. It was a process, he warned, but the initial findings were undeniable. He gave me a letter of preliminary findings, a powerful document on official Osage Nation letterhead. Now for Phase 2, setting the trap. I knew Carol's weakness was her ego. She couldn't stand being ignored or defied. I needed to bait her into overplaying her hand, preferably on camera. So, I did something that seemed counterintuitive. I started to comply. I went to a hardware store and bought a dozen wooden survey stakes and a ball of bright orange twine. I spent a Saturday morning hammering them into the ground along the edges of the path. I made it look like I was marking out the area for excavation. I even had a friend with a small bobcat drive it onto my paved driveway and leave it there for a day, visible from the street. The bait was in the water. It didn't take long for the shark to circle. That afternoon, my security camera sent a motion alert to my phone. I watched the live feed. There she was. Carol, dressed in what I could only describe as suburban combat khakis, was power-walking toward my property. She didn't come to the door. She marched straight past my house and onto the gravel path. She stood there, hands on her hips, surveying my handiwork. Then, with a look of pure fury, she started kicking over my stakes. She ripped them out of the ground and threw them into the woods. She tore down the orange twine, her face twisted in a sneer. I sat in my office, watching on my monitor, a slow, cold smile spreading across my face. I hit record. She wasn't done. She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures, presumably as evidence for her next tyrannical decree. Then she began to speak, apparently leaving herself a voicemail or a voice note. The camera's microphone was surprisingly good. Absolutely unacceptable, her tinny voice crackled through my speakers. He thinks he can do a cheap, unapproved job himself. I'll show him. I will get the board to issue an emergency order. We'll have a professional crew in here by Monday to rip this whole thing out, and he'll be paying for it for the rest of his life. He has no idea who he's dealing with. Oh, I knew, Carol. I knew exactly who I was dealing with. And you had just committed trespass, vandalism, and confessed your intent to illegally modify my property, all captured in beautiful 4K resolution. Thank you. The stage was now set for the first reveal. The next HOA meeting was in 3 days. The agenda, which she had posted online, had a special item, emergency discussion and vote on remediation for Lot 42. She was fast-tracking her attack. Perfect. I RSVP'd to the meeting. And I noted that I would be bringing a guest. The community center meeting room was more packed than usual. Carol had clearly whipped the neighborhood into a frenzy. I saw worried faces, people who were probably my friends but were too intimidated to speak up. I saw the glares from Carol's loyalists. I sat in the back row. Next to me sat William Blackwood, the Osage Nation THPO, looking calm and out of place in his simple jacket and slacks amidst the sea of pressed polos and blouses. Carol began the meeting, her voice dripping with self-importance. She skipped straight to the main event. As you all know, she began, we have been dealing with a serious compliance issue at Lot 42. Despite multiple notices and generous extensions, the owner has refused to bring his property up to community standards. She clicked a remote, and a picture of my gravel path appeared on the projector screen. It was one of the photos she'd taken while trespassing. This mess is a blight on our community. It lowers our property values and presents a dusty, unkempt image. After the owner began unauthorized and unapproved work this past weekend, she flashed a picture of my survey stakes. I was forced to inspect the situation personally. A murmur went through the crowd. She was admitting to trespassing. I remained silent. Therefore, she announced, her voice rising triumphantly, I have a motion on the floor for an emergency expenditure. I have a quote from A1 Paving, a very reputable company, to fully excavate and pave this path with asphalt for $32,000. The cost will be covered by our reserve funds and then placed as a priority lien on the property of the non-compliant owner. Do I have a second? Her crony on the board immediately seconded the motion. Carol looked around the room, a smug smile on her face. Any discussion? I stood up. I have a point of information. All eyes turned to me. Carol's smile tightened. This is a discussion for homeowners, Mark. What could you possibly have to add? I'd like to introduce my guest, I said, gesturing to the men beside me. This is Mr. William Blackwood. He's the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Osage Nation. He has some information about this dirt track that I think the board, and our reserve fund, will find very interesting. Mr. Blackwood stood up. The room was dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the industrial carpet. Carol's face was a mask of confusion. What? What does that have to do with anything? This is a private community matter. Mr. Blackwood spoke, his voice calm and steady, but it filled the room with an authority Carol's shrieking could never match. Ma'am, my name is William Blackwood. The path you are planning to pave is, according to our extensive research and physical evaluation, a preserved section of the Osage Trace, a significant ancestral trail of my people. He paused, letting the words sink in. Under the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 and several state statutes, it is a protected historical site. Any unauthorized alteration, and certainly its destruction via paving, is a federal offense, carrying severe penalties, including fines upward of $100,000 and potential prison time. He held up the letter he had given me. I have here our preliminary official findings, which have been filed with the State Historic Preservation Office. Any action taken against this site will be met with the full force of federal law. The color drained from Carol's face. She looked like she'd been slapped. The smugness vanished, replaced by a sputtering rage. This is ridiculous. It's a trick, she stammered, pointing a trembling finger at me. He's making this up to get out of his responsibilities. He's hired this person to lie for him. The insult hung in the air. Mr. Blackwood's expression didn't change, but his eyes hardened. Ma'am, I am a federally recognized officer of a sovereign nation. To suggest I would lie about our history is a grave insult. The evidence is indisputable. The state archaeologist's office will be confirming our findings next week. I would strongly advise this board to table your motion indefinitely. The room erupted in whispers. My neighbors weren't looking at me with suspicion anymore. They were looking at Carol, their HOA president, who had just tried to get them to vote to commit a federal crime. Her power was cracking like cheap concrete. Arthur, the timid treasurer, looked pale. Carol, maybe we should postpone the vote. Carol shot him a look of pure venom. She wasn't defeated. She was cornered. And a cornered animal is the most dangerous. This meeting is adjourned, she shrieked, banging her gavel so hard the plastic base cracked. She gathered her things and stormed out of the room, her face a thunderous mask of fury. I had won the battle, but I knew the war was far from over. I had publicly humiliated her. I had stripped away her credibility in front of the entire neighborhood. She wasn't going to let that go. Her retaliation would be swift, and it would be vicious. I was right. The very next day, the real ugliness began. Carol, deprived of her official power for the moment, turned to the court of public opinion, the Oak Haven Estates Facebook group. She launched a smear campaign that was both breathtaking in its dishonesty and terrifying in its calculated cruelty. She posted a long, hysterical screed. She claimed I was a scheming developer, in disguise. She alleged I had fabricated the Heritage Trail story as a ploy to have my property rezoned for commercial use. He wants to turn our quiet neighborhood into a tourist trap, she wrote. Imagine the tour buses, the strangers walking past your backyards, the noise, the trash. He is trying to destroy our way of life for his own personal profit. It was a masterpiece of fear-mongering. She was painting me as an existential threat to their peaceful suburban existence. The comments section exploded. People who had been on the fence at the meeting were now panicking. I don't want strangers near my kids, one person wrote. Our property values will plummet, wrote another. It didn't stop there. She escalated from my finances to my character. Finding no actual dirt on me, she decided to invent some. The next post was darker. It was a vague, insinuation-laden warning about new residents whose backgrounds we don't know, and the importance of being vigilant for the sake of our children. She was trying to paint me as a predator. That crossed a line I hadn't even known existed. This wasn't about a path anymore. This was a vicious, personal attack designed to ruin my life and drive me out of the community. Then she went after my livelihood. On Monday morning, I got a call from my boss, the head of my engineering firm. He sounded deeply uncomfortable. "Mark, I got a very strange call this morning," he said. "A woman named Carol claimed she was the president of your HOA. She said you were mentally unstable, a danger to the community, and that the firm should be concerned about your fitness for duty." My blood ran cold. "She said you were under investigation for threatening behavior and were making bizarre historical claims to cover up illegal construction on your property," he continued. "Mark, what the hell is going on?" I spent the next hour explaining the entire situation to him. Thankfully, I had worked there for 20 years. My reputation was solid. He believed me, but he was still concerned. "This woman sounds unhinged," he said. "Watch your back." Unhinged was an understatement. She was waging a campaign of total destruction. I knew I had to end this, and end it for good. The evidence I had, the trespassing, the public slander, was good. But I needed something more. I needed something that would not just discredit her, but remove her from power permanently. I needed a kill shot. And then, it came to me. Not from my own investigation, but from the last place I ever expected. My phone rang late one night. The number was blocked. I almost didn't answer. "Hello." The voice on the other end was quiet, trembling. "Is this Mark?" "Yes." "Who is this?" This is Arthur. From the HOA board." I was stunned into silence. "Arthur, the treasurer." Carol's meek little shadow. I can't stand what she's doing," he whispered, his voice cracking. "The lies she's posting, the things she's saying about you, it's wrong. It's gone too far." "I appreciate that, Arthur," I said carefully. "But why are you calling me?" "Because it's not just about you," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "It's about the money. The paving contract." My senses went on high alert. "What about it?" "The company, A1 Paving, it's owned by her cousin," Arthur said in a rush. "The quote she got, $32,000. It's inflated by at least $15,000. That extra money was going to be a kickback, split between them. She was going to use our reserve funds to pay her own family." My God. It wasn't just about power. It was about greed. Classic, simple, criminal greed. "Can you prove it?" I asked, my voice low and steady. "Yes," he whispered. "She's been doing this for years, in smaller ways. Landscaping contracts, pool maintenance, legal retainers, always with companies connected to her or her family. She hides it in the budget, calls it community improvements. I have the real invoices. I have the bank statements. I have emails between her and her cousin discussing the paving kickback. I have everything. This was it. The silver bullet. The kill shot. Embezzlement. Fraud. Conspiracy. These weren't HOA bylaw violations. These were felonies." "Arthur," I said, "you are doing a very brave thing. Can you get me copies of all of that?" "I already have them," he said. "I made copies weeks ago. I was too afraid to do anything. But after what she did to you, I can't be a part of it anymore. I'll leave a flash drive in your mailbox tomorrow morning before she wakes up." The line went dead. I sat there in the dark, my heart pounding. The final piece of the puzzle had just been handed to me. Carol's harmonious residential character was a facade for a personal slush fund. She wasn't protecting property values, she was lining her pockets. The next morning, the flash drive was there, tucked inside a plain white envelope. I spent the day going through the files. It was all there, just as Arthur had said. A meticulous record of years of graft and corruption. The paving scheme was the most audacious, but it was part of a clear, long-term pattern. My plan had been to use the historical preservation angle to defend myself. But this changed everything. This was no longer a defensive action. This was an offensive strike. I didn't call the local police. Carol probably had them on a Christmas card list. I didn't call a lawyer to send a cease and desist. This was far beyond that. I compiled everything I had into a single, comprehensive evidence package. The video of her trespassing and vandalism. Screenshots of the libelous Facebook posts. The recording of her threatening me. A sworn affidavit from my boss about her attempt to get me fired. And the crown jewel, the entire contents of Arthur's flash drive, neatly organized into folders labeled fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. I made an appointment not with the city police, but with the economic crimes unit of the district attorney's office. I sat across from a sharp, no-nonsense detective and an assistant district attorney. I laid out the story from the beginning, starting with the mailbox and ending with the flash drive. I presented my evidence chronologically. I didn't editorialize or get emotional. I presented it like an engineering report: problem, data, analysis, conclusion. When I was finished, the ADA looked at the detective. The detective looked at me. "Mr. Mark," the ADA said slowly, "you've just handed us a conviction on a silver platter." Over the next week, I worked with them to plan the final act. They wanted to make sure the arrest was clean and that they could seize all of the HOA's financial records at the same time. The ADA had an idea for how to orchestrate it. A perfect, public finale. "She likes public meetings, right?" he asked with a thin smile. "Let's give her one she'll never forget." The plan was set. Arthur, at the DA's instruction, called for a special emergency HOA meeting. The official topic was to address resident concerns and misinformation regarding the Lot 42 path and to review recent community expenditures. It was the perfect bait. Carol would see it as a chance to publicly crucify me and shut down Arthur's dissent. She would never suspect what was really coming. I also made one more call, to a contact at the local news station. I told her there was a major story of public corruption about to break at an HOA meeting in Oak Haven and that she might want to have a camera crew there. The night of the meeting, the community center was standing room only. The news van was parked discreetly down the street. The air was electric with tension. My neighbors were divided, confused, angry. Carol sat at the head table, looking imperious and confident. She thought this was her stage, her moment to re-establish her dominance. Two men in suits sat quietly in the back. They didn't look like residents. They were the detectives from the DA's office. Carol banged the gavel. "I call this emergency meeting to order. It has come to my attention that there is a great deal of malicious gossip and misinformation being spread by a certain resident to avoid his community obligations." She launched into a 10-minute tirade against me, repeating the lies from Facebook, painting herself as the tireless guardian of the neighborhood, and me as the devil incarnate. I let her speak. I let her dig her grave a little deeper, with every lie a shovelful of dirt. When she was finally done, she turned to Arthur. "And now, to address the so-called concerns about expenditures. Arthur, perhaps you'd like to explain your sudden interest in questioning my prudent management of our funds." Her voice was laced with menace. Arthur, pale but resolute, stood up. "Actually, Carol," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "I think Mark has a presentation on that." All eyes turned to me. I walked to the front of the room, holding a flash drive. It was a copy of the one I'd given the DA. I plugged it into the laptop connected to the projector. "Good evening, everyone," I said calmly. "Carol is right. There has been a lot of misinformation. I'd like to clear some of it up with facts." The first slide was a picture of my property survey. Fact 1, the path is, and always has been, my private property. The next slide was a still from the security video of Carol on my property. Fact 2, on this date, Carol knowingly trespassed on my property. I played the video clip. The whole room watched her kicking over my stakes, heard her threatening to destroy my property. A collective gasp went through the room. Carol jumped to her feet. "This is illegally obtained. It's inadmissible. It was recorded on my private property, Carol." "It's perfectly legal," I said, not taking my eyes off the screen. Next slide. I put up screenshots of her Facebook posts, the ones where she called me a developer and insinuated I was a danger to children. Fact 3, Carol has engaged in a public campaign of libel and slander against me. The murmurs in the room grew louder. People were looking at her with open disgust. "And finally," I said, my voice dropping slightly, "let's talk about those community expenditures. I clicked to the next slide. It was a scanned copy of the A1 paving invoice for $32,000. Next to it, I put up a public record document showing the owner of A1 paving, a man with the same last name as Carol. Her cousin. The room fell completely silent. And here, I said, clicking again, is an email, obtained from a concerned board member, between Carol and her cousin, discussing how they would split the $15,000 overage on the contract. The email was projected onto the screen for everyone to see. The damning words, clear as day. Just make sure the invoice looks legit. $15K is a nice little bonus for us. It was at this moment that Carol completely and utterly broke. Lies, she screamed, her face purple with rage. They're all lies. Forged. Arthur, you traitor. I'll ruin you. She lunged toward Arthur, but she was so blinded by fury she didn't see the two detectives moving swiftly up the aisle. It's not just the paving, is it, Carol? I said, my voice cutting through her shrieks. I clicked through a dozen more slides, inflated landscaping bills from her brother-in-law's company, exorbitant legal fees paid to a firm where her son was a partner, pool chemicals purchased at 3 times the market rate from an online store traced back to her own credit card. It was all there. A mountain of evidence. The entire neighborhood was seeing, in real time, how their money had been stolen for years. Carol was babbling now, a torrent of denials and accusations. In her panic, she made her final, fatal mistake. I deserved that money, she shrieked, pointing at the crowd. I work harder than any of you. I keep this place perfect. A little compensation is the least I deserve for putting up with you ungrateful people. It was a full confession, screamed in a room full of witnesses. One of the detectives stepped up beside her. Carol, he said, his voice calm but firm. I think you've said quite enough. You're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. He took her arm. She tried to pull away, but the other detective took her other arm. The sight of the HOA president, the Queen of Oak Haven, being held by 2 state police detectives broke the spell of fear she had held over the community for years. As they put the cuffs on her, her eyes found mine across the room. They were filled with a black, bottomless hatred. You, she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. You will regret this. I will destroy you if it's the last thing I do. It was the last, impotent threat of a fallen tyrant. No one was scared of her anymore. As they led her out of the room, past the flashing cameras of the news crew that had just entered, the room was silent for a moment. Then, someone started to clap. Then another. And another. Soon the entire room was filled with applause. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The story was the lead on the 10 o'clock news. HOA president arrested for embezzlement scheme, Carol's reign was over. The HOA was effectively dissolved and then reformed under a new, interim board headed by a retired accountant who was horrified by the state of the books. The remaining cronies on the old board resigned in disgrace. The ridiculous bylaws were systematically reviewed and rewritten with common sense and a respect for private property rights. The color of your mailbox was no longer a matter of public concern. Carol's fate was sealed. Faced with the mountain of evidence I had compiled, she took a plea deal. She was sentenced to 3 years in state prison and ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA, a sum totaling over $200,000. Her house was sold to cover the debt. She lost everything, her home, her status, her freedom. The community began to heal. The fear was gone, replaced by a sense of liberation. Neighbors started talking to each other again. Block parties were organized. The oppressive atmosphere of sterile perfection lifted, and the neighborhood started to feel like a real community. As for me, I finally found the peace I had been looking for. The Osage Trace on my property was officially designated a state heritage trail. A small, tasteful bronze plaque was placed at the head of the path, explaining its significance. It was done in cooperation with the Osage Nation, and the trail itself remained private property, accessible only by invitation, preserving its tranquility. Sometimes, my new, friendlier neighbors would ask to walk the path, and I was happy to let them. They would walk it with a quiet reverence, a sense of awe for the history that lay right under their feet, history that had almost been paved over by greed and arrogance. One evening, a few months after it was all over, I was sitting on my back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. The air was calm. The only sound was the chirping of crickets and the rustle of leaves in the pine trees. I thought about the journey I'd been on. I had started as a man just trying to hold on to a memory, to a small piece of a life that had been taken from him. I never wanted a fight. I just wanted to be left alone with my grief and my gravel path. But Carol, in her hubris, had forced my hand. She had pushed and pushed until she awakened the engineer inside me, the part of me that couldn't stand to see a flawed system go uncorrected. She thought she was dealing with a sad, lonely man. She never realized she was dealing with a man who knew how to read the blueprints, find the stress fractures, and apply just the right amount of pressure to bring the whole rotten structure crashing down. I had stood up to a bully, not just for me, but for the memory of my wife, and for a history much older than any of us. It was a strange kind of poetic justice. The path Eleanor had loved for its quiet spirit turned out to have a spirit that was ancient and powerful, a spirit that, in the end, had protected itself and protected me. I stood up and walked down to the path. The gravel crunched under my feet, a familiar and reassuring sound. I touched the cool bronze of the plaque. I looked down the long, winding trail, disappearing into the twilight shadows. My connection to Eleanor. A testament to a forgotten people. And a reminder that sometimes, the only way to find peace is to go to war. And as I stood there, under the vast, quiet sky, I felt her presence, a sense of approval, of a job well done. Our home was safe. The path was safe. And for the first time in a very long time, my heart was truly at peace.